Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Matt Gjertsen from Better Everyday Studios. I am joined today by Seyka Mejeur of AdAstra Talent Advisors. How are you doing, Seyka?
Doing well. Thanks, Matt.
Excellent. And I am also joined by Justus Kilian from Space Capital. How are you doing, Justus?
Hey, Matt. Great.
I'm really excited for the conversation today, especially from the two of you, because at least for me, when I've looked at companies, I think one of the most common challenges that comes up is over hiring. They grow too fast, and I hear inside startups, every person early on is saying they don't have enough people, they don't have enough resources, they need more. But if you don't check that, then you can really quickly become several hundred, even a couple thousand people in your organization before you've really set off on the mission. And, we know a lot about the story of the beginnings of SpaceX, how Hans Koenigsmann often talks about the reason why he went there is because he came from these giant aerospace companies and was excited about the idea of, can you launch a rocket to space with just a couple hundred people? And so there's obviously a lot of success in keeping teams small. But I also think it's interesting. A number of years ago, I remember hearing an interview with Jason Fried, who's the founder of 37 Signals. And he was looking at kind of like the internet startup ecosystem. This was maybe 5 years ago. And one of the things that he was reflecting on was that the challenge is that every company that was starting wanted to be the next Facebook. And so they were using the Facebook model, which meant from day one, they needed to raise $100 million because they needed 200 senior engineers and like all this stuff just to get started. And I do think there's a tendency to, in today's world, like everybody wants to be SpaceX. And so like this from the get-go, you want to like build for scale when maybe you don't need scale yet. So that's a very long-winded way of explaining why I'm really interested to know how you limit that. Seyka, I know obviously you're helping hire people into these companies. How do you advise them on when is the right time to hire?
Great question. I think that when it comes to, so in the early days of a startup, people are bandwidth constrained so much. We've got a drink when you say the word capacity, right? Limited capacity. When people are the hiring managers and the teams that need additional support are the ones in the most pain, first of all. So I think there's something interesting to talk about here, which is the person who is feeling the most acute pain for the role that they would like to hire may get soft on their requirements and the rest of the company to hold them accountable to what they really need because they're like, I'll take a body, right? And might get to that point. So that's one interesting piece about scaling intentionally is being rigorous about who is being hired, even when you just really, really need help. The second point is being very clear about what the person you're hiring is going to accomplish and having that tied to very clear technical milestones that you're building out, right? And I think a lot of that is built on item number 3, which is having strong operational component within the organization that allows a high level of visibility over team growth that is associated with the technical milestones so that you don't have people kind of off making decisions without it being orchestrated company-wide.
How often do you see that happen? Because I think, I've heard that a lot about often companies, especially when they're growing quickly. I've heard that a lot about often companies at different points, just the operational control, because it seems like it should be easy, but it also is a common problem, it seems like.
Yeah, I think it is a common problem, and it seems like it would be easy until you look at just how much each person is trying to accomplish, right? And when they get the blinders on and they're looking at what their team needs to do with X amount of capital and X amount of time, they can kind of start making, and maybe the person who they think of as kind of the organizational orchestrator is is a pretty big bottleneck on decision making, you can see how it pretty easily turns into, okay, well, let's not kind of go through that vein because that's too backed up.
Yeah.
Let's just make the decision in order to meet our agreed upon timelines.
And when you're in a company where you're trying to create a culture of ownership and execution, then it kind of says, I should just be able to go. I should just be able to go do this. Yeah, I can see that happens. And I love the also tying this to specific problems that you're being solved, because I know in previous conversations we've talked about this idea of, knowing which fires you can let burn, and what questions are we trying to answer it with this round of funding. I feel like that probably plays into here, where a founder or the executive team be like, yes, we agree that this is a problem and that you need more resources, but that's not the most important problem right now. I'm sure being able to align the problem that this role is meant to solve with the priorities of the problems the company needs to solve is probably a pretty important thing.
Yes, exactly. And I'm a little speak out of both sides of my mouth here, because on one hand, I think for this exact reason that we're talking about, it's really important to have clear responsibilities and objectives for each person who's joining the organization. And then to speak out of the other side of my mouth, I'll say sometimes the person's so great that you go, okay, this wasn't a role that we had scoped out, but this person is worth just bringing them in. And how I'll kind of bring those both together, so I'm not just being a massive hypocrite here, is to say that even when someone is so great that you say, let's just bring them in, we still are being clear. Maybe we're creating a new role, or we're taking two pieces of two other roles that we had scoped out and saying, this is what you own, and then you can come in and grab things as you see them, but you're still creating that structure of why they're there.
What's the most common way you see that companies maintain, kind of, whether it's the hiring authority or like the veto authority? Is it just, is it the CEO needs to sign off on every rec? Is it like what do you see as the most common successful ways to keep those controls?
I would say it's not necessarily based on one person. I think that
Okay.
can get very bottlenecky, and it can also create this problem where teams go, okay, well, it takes a lot of time to get feedback from that person. Let's get this problem going. They get momentum, they build up process, they get things, they spend a lot of resources and time, is what I'm saying here, right? Getting it going. And then they take it to the veto person and they go, no. And you're like, wow, that was a lot of wasted time spent on that. So I think that what is a successful path is to be very clear about what the process is. So that takes more time up front, but it can give you different access points to the go, no go, or kind of decision-making matrix. And you have to be very thoughtful about what sort of demands on individuals' time that process is going to make. I kid you not. It is a big conversation that I have with companies that I'm advising is, let's talk about the process. Okay, let's put into a spreadsheet how we can estimate how many people for hiring, right? How many people you'll need to talk to in order to hire for this role. If we're saying that every final contestant needs to have a 2-hour interview with your CEO, how many times does your CEO have a 2-hour block? And these are real situations that have been suggested, right? And so you can get really numerical about what's realistic and what those estimated timelines are, and then be able to be honest about if that's really what you want.
Justus, in a past conversation, you were talking about like round kind of seasons of funding, right? When markets are high and there's lots of money around, a lot of venture firms will say, like, get all the money you can and grow as much as you can, and then when the markets shift, everybody says, okay, now you need to lay off, now you need to get conservative. But you said, like, that's not a very sophisticated way or deliberate way of going about things. But I think we all probably saw that, and there's a lot of companies that had that happen to them 5 years ago, and then going as seasons changed. So how do you, when you're advising these companies, what are you looking for them to do to make sure they don't grow too quickly?
Yeah, so I think there's two categories of like impact that make this or drivers that make this problem so complicated. And so the first one that you were alluding to based on those past conversations are sort of like macro effects, right? Like every company's subject to the way the market, the rallies up and the cyclical turns down, and you have to respond to that. And so, you know, um, it just is true, right? And that causes outcomes. I think within that, there right now within space tech, there's two macro drivers that are sort of like reinforcing this idea of like hire fast and sort of overbuild. And I think that there are two things that companies really can't control. There's too much money out there. Okay. So in the last 3 years, like VCs have consolidated into these, monolithic entities, and, there's 10, 15, 20 multi-billion-dollar firms. And for them to drive the outcomes that they need in their portfolios, companies have to achieve, it's not sufficient to be a unicorn anymore. You have to be, 10 billion, 50 billion, $100 billion outcome. And therefore, the rounds get bigger, the hiring gets bigger, everybody's aiming bigger. The idea just inherently has to be bigger. And so that pressure is sort of forcing, I think, some of that underlying growth. The second is like inherent to the space industry. I think there's this legacy space problem here where it's like, given the primes and the government as an anchor customer, it's like, if we just build this exquisite thing, they'll pay for it, right? And they'll pay whatever really, they need because they absolutely need it. And so, that mentality, I think, still does trickle over where, if you build it, they will come. And so it's like, we'll just continue to invest in R&D and CapEx and build this thing, and eventually the customers will materialize. Frankly, that's a fallacy, and that's not how you should be building companies. So then you get to the company specific level is driving this problem. There's two aspects here that, I think are important. And the second one is really, I think, what sets the control. So the first one is like, you don't understand the customer because you're building this beautiful, exquisite technical thing, right? And customer demand can be opaque. And so you're raising capital off of some uncertainty around that. And you just really don't understand the nature of your customers. A good example of this is NASA. Maybe you progress through a phase 1, a phase 2 SBIR, and you're building, towards like, potentially the Artemis program. But a new administration comes in and that changes, right? And so there's so much uncertainty there. If that's your single bet as your anchor customer and a big contract, you're exposed to a tremendous amount of risk. I see a lot of companies in the startup and the space ecosystem listing other space startups as their customers. And that customer traction is dependent on them raising other capital to pay you. And so the compounding of the risk there is significant. The same with defense. The number of startups that have won programs of record over the last 50 years is minuscule. In the last 6 months, it's increased significantly, but it's still like nothing in the drop of the annual spending. And so it's very unlikely that, most companies will materialize into that program of record. And so growing based on a lack of understanding of your customers is part of what's driving that. And you can get better at that. You can understand and listen to your customers better. The second thing is most startups and actually most venture investors aren't very sophisticated when it comes to financials. You're not paying attention to how you're spending money. You don't care about the bottom line because you're just saying we'll grow and eventually one day be profitable. So, you grow at all costs. It's this blitz scaling mentality. We'll figure out the unit economics after we go public. That's incorrect. You have to hire based on seeing revenue from a core product, actually realizing that revenue, like commitments or, LOIs or, is insufficient to hire. And you have to go to a deeper level and look at that, business vertical and that, product that you're building and understand the unit economics and what scale at which you have to operate to actually be able to be profitable. And if you're throwing so many people behind that, it's going to be very hard for those unit economics to ever actually be profitable. And so there's this discipline that being a financially aware organization creates that, anchors your hiring based on not only technical milestones, but also financial milestones. And, the dearth of capital that's available, the lack of understanding of customers, it all reinforces these things and makes it even harder for founders. But, that's where I think you actually get discipline, and where the board needs to bring discipline to a company and, set some guardrails up.
Yeah, I feel like definitely, again, going back pre-pandemic, 2018, 2019, there's definitely that feeling of grow at all costs. Let's just like grow, and the money will be there. And then we obviously went through a severe contraction for at least a year or two, that in everything that I was hearing, it felt like there was a real attempt to bring that, to kind of like beat that financial discipline. Have any of those lessons continued, or based on kind of your view, is it that because there is so much capital still like out there, that maybe the mood is shifting again, and you're really having to reinforce those lessons again?
No, I think the mood, like the lessons, are sort of remembered or short lived. And, with AI and defense, it's like grow at all costs, because you got to capture market share now, and now is the time to do it. And so I think there's almost been a complete sort of reversion back towards that mentality. And ultimately, I think it does a disservice, not only to the companies, but the employees. Like, there's a belief that there's value in the equity. Building an undisciplined business that doesn't have any awareness of like their financials and any effort to actually building a sustainable business, really puts your future in the hands of somebody else, right? More venture investors piling more money into your company in the hope that one day somebody will come in and actually be disciplined. But if you build that company in a disciplined way throughout, and have a scarcity mindset, and actually hire when you start to see something be profitable or the economics start to make sense, you can be the master of your own fate and not be, entirely dependent on your investors to come bail you out. And it's safer for your employees. It's safer for the founders. It's just good business. But somehow that lesson has gotten lost in the, attempts to keep blowing these bubbles and just play the momentum game of, how quickly can we push up the valuation and grow to try to capture a big opportunity.
Yeah, Seyka, to bring this back to you, I guess kind of like based on your experiences, how often do you see really strong correlations in when you're talking with companies of there's just tons of everybody wants to hire now because we just closed a round, or and is it more, because it sounds like from what I'm picking up from Justus is like there's what your company control, and there's those external forces. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, based on your experience, is hiring tend to be driven by external forces more than what the company can control?
So yes and no. We absolutely see these big waves of requests, right? We now need help filling, like scaling, adding a bunch of people to our team because there was just a big influx of funding. And we see that across multiple companies at the same time. And then, so there are serious ebbs and flows indicated by external forces. Of course, we do also see companies that are diligent about timelines and milestones and really aim to stick to that more than kind of like grab it when you can and then do a burst, right? That seem to be a little bit more diligent about what we're trying to hit. They're typically able to predict the sort of support and help that they are looking for over the next 6 to 12 months, if not longer. And it feels a bit more metered from some.
When you are going through those big waves, it's hard to think about it in a controlled fashion. It's hard to create structure when you're going through that. And so I could almost imagine a world where when hiring gets slow, or when you're just before you get to that next round, it's like, okay, let's take the opportunity now to figure out what is a process. I guess that's another question I would have for you, Seyka, is how often do you see there's a process in place, but it was for a certain level of hiring, and then they go to hire more and all of a sudden realize that process breaks at scale?
Absolutely. And if you haven't, right, a good example is one that you brought up earlier, kind of saying, is the CEO the final yes, no, and that works to a certain level, and then it really doesn't. and figuring out what that means within your company culture, who is going to be making those decisions, and how do you empower them and train them such that when you hit that point of scaling, they're enabled to make those strategic decisions without having oversight from the person above them.
I guess final question I have for you, Justus, is how often are you going to companies that you're talking with and saying like, I don't think you should hire right now, or I don't think you should grow right now, since so much of what you obviously probably want, I would assume, is for them to grow?
There's a little bit of nuance in that question.
Of course.
We typically invest at the earliest stages, and we're looking to, build out that like first 5, 10, 15 hires. And so in that case, it's always about like pushing to do the right hiring early.
Yeah.
I would say almost every situation we lead an investment or invest, the founding team has about 50% clarity on the people that they're going to hire. And even when we're doing diligence, sort of going through that process, they can name the roles, they can name the people, and it's a good fit. We're aligned. But that other 50% that they're thinking about, that's where I encourage a little bit more caution. It's like, okay, we're not just going to tap our immediate network. We don't already have somebody in mind for this role. We maybe don't have the role fully scoped out. There isn't a need within the first 3 months of closing the round then probably to fill that out. Like it would have hit your priority list. So let's take a little bit of time. Let's make sure we think about this role. Let's get the first ones right. Let's get those employees onboarded, and then let's move to it. So it doesn't all have to happen at once. I do sort of have a deeper philosophical question about this, which is we're starting to see in software companies that you can build, billion-dollar companies with like 20 or 40 or 100 employees, given, some of the lift that you're starting to get into AI. I'm curious if, anybody thinks that will be possible or replicable, on like a hardware side, a deep tech company. Is this idea that you can overhire a thing of the past because AI is going to, actually solve some of the problems? Or do we think that it's less the case and now like people are even more of a sort of differentiating advantage in sort of deep tech?
I don't know. I think in general, it is. I do think we'll see some of it clearly, where there's going to be less need to solve each individual problem, but I think there's always more problems to solve. I think the best way it was described to me, or I heard on a podcast where if I might have said it in discussion with you all once, if a software engineer becomes 10 times more productive, that doesn't mean I need 1/10 the software engineers. It means I'm getting 10x the ROI from that software engineer. So if anything, I want to invest more capital and hire more software engineers because I'm getting more ROI from them. And so I think the ideal situation would be that if AI and automation makes individual workers just that much more productive, then we end up just having more workers doing all the more stuff because, we still have billions of people on this planet that we need to lift out of poverty. We still have, a giant portion of the planet that is untapped from a resource perspective or a utilization perspective. We have an entire solar system that we want to go after. So there's no end to the things that we can do. I don't know if that I think that's where I'm approaching it from a philosophical level. I don't know if that exactly answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard is, people talking about like the diamond pyramid where we have a lot of people at the entry level and, there's layers of management on top. Like potentially that turns into like a diamond shape structure where it's like
I could see
light
that
at the bottom, heavy at the middle with a lot of people that are doing the more strategic thinking, and then, the same sort of executive level. And so, there just will be fewer people required to do the same work at, that sort of entry level. And one example that I'm starting to see is like, at a firmware level or, as opposed to doing a lot of the low level coding and really digging into some of the basic integrations and map, like a lot of the busy work that comes from that. AI is like really great at being able to, come in and help try to automate some of that firmware level. It doesn't mean that you won't need a firmware engineer. You'll need them to do, the more sophisticated thing at a higher level, right?
How do you avoid overhiring? I think, Justus, from what you were saying, like a lot of times it sounds like overhiring can get driven by external forces. There's lots of things that are happening out in the world that lead companies to say like, oh, we got to take advantage of this now. We got to grow now. Let's go. And the only hope of keeping that under control from both you and kind of what you were explaining, Seyka, is having really rigorous controls inside your organization that come down to understanding what is the process for hiring, why do you hire, and do you have a system in place to make sure you have visibility of that whole process so that things aren't kind of happening under the radar. I think it's a really good way to kind of think about it, and that it's not all under your control, but you gotta control what you can control if you want to make sure that you're not over hiring before you need to. So thank you both so much. Thanks everybody for listening, and I look forward to all of our future conversations.
Thanks, you guys.